I'm Andrew Kercher with Thumb Coast TV. This week, we're back in Port Huron. We're going to be talking a little bit about historic districts, a historic church, and a building on my critically endangered list. It might be your last chance to see this historic structure. I hope you'll come with me around the block to see it all. So this week, like I mentioned, we're back here in Port Huron, and we're in our historic district on Court Street. This is the Old Town Historic District. We're going to be talking a little bit about some of these buildings, but as always, we owe a debt of gratitude to our sponsor. That's Adair Supply. Go ahead and check them out. They're in Adair. They're open year-round and have some amazing supplies for all of your historic building needs and modern building needs as well. Check them out, Adair Supply. But as I mentioned, we're in the historic district. So as you've kind of seen maybe behind me, we got a great big building here. This is the old First Congregational Church. But I'm going to flip things around and we're going to talk about some of these historic buildings right here across the street. So this is the corner of Court and 6th. And there are some amazing structures and a great variety of historic buildings out here to take a peek at. And unfortunately, they are in a historic district. And I think one of the things we'll talk about this week is also a little bit about what that entails, what kind of protections it offers, maybe what you can and can't do, because that is going to vary a little bit. But right here, this is a jewel on the corner. This is a Ballentine House. So you've probably heard of those Ballentine lofts downtown. The Ballentine House is the home associated with it, and it's actually a French Gothic revival style. So this has been beautifully restored. The Mosses, Trish and Carl, have done a number of homes in Port Huron. They're very dedicated preservationists, so they're always working. They've done a number of projects, and this one they have since sold. They don't live here or anything, and so it's in the hands of its next steward, who I know are doing a very good job of keeping this up, because that's one of the things about historic homes. They always take a lot of maintenance. Some of these homes we don't know the exact date for. This is probably late 1850s, maybe early 1860s. You know, some of those tax records just don't exist, or there's a pretty bad fire at City Hall. That'll be a recurring theme today. So we don't know, but we can definitely see some really cool architectural influences. Like I said, we see a little bit of Gothic in this and a little bit of Queen Anne. I really like the polychromatic paint scheme. So we've got kind of grays and creams and a great burgundy that really pops on this with a great big porch. So very asymmetrical. That's very typical for Queen Anne, but we also see some elements inside of some of that original Gothic massing to the building. So a really cool structure that borders right here on the corner. It's right next to another one of these historic homes. Now, as I mentioned before, we are in the historic district. So this is a district that actually offers some protections and actually an ability to sometimes even get some funding to keep these old buildings around. Here's another one from the 1860s. This is kind of an Italianate cube. So it's got these doubled up brackets right up on the top, and one of the things I really like is seeing the brackets kind of mirrored here on the bottom on the porch. And this is another one very typical kind of that style and well kept up. But one of the big things I want to talk about today is something you never want to see in the historic world, and that is the result of a fire. Many of you, if you're big into the area or you follow historic buildings, you know there was a pretty bad fire at the building next door here just a few weeks ago, and you can see this really kind of gutted out the entire top side. It's very sad to see, very sad to kind of think about, you know, what that remains. I don't want to prognosticate too much about the future, but sometimes when you see fires this bad, the likelihood of some of these buildings being, you know, completely restored can be pretty low. And in fact, one of the really tragic things is sometimes you can see that a fire can even damage nearby. So we see just how much damage was even done to the building next door. Those fires can get out of control in a hurry. So we see some broken glass, some scorching. I'm really hoping they'll be able to restore some of the soffit and the other feature up there next door, because that brick will hold up, but obviously any of those wooden elements can be a real concern. Obviously, the number one thing, glad to hear that there wasn't, as far as I know, any injuries or fatalities or anything like that. That's always number one. One kind of interesting thing, and we can kind of sneak over here to the side, we can actually see where some of the vinyl siding has melted and revealing that original wood clapboard behind. Of course, you know, very badly scorched closer to that window, but we can actually see some of that peeling back through the layers and some of the original wood soffit that's there underneath. And as we kind of look in, again, that fire very damaging. And it's a matter of this, anything can be restored, right? You know, if you have unlimited money, there's nothing stopping you from completely restoring something. It's a question of, you know, a value proposition. And it is in a historic district. One of the things that I find really interesting about this house, this one in particular, is a lot of people might overlook it because there are some beautiful, you know, high architectural styles like the Italianate and the, you know, kind of French Gothic. Next to it, we also see, again, some beautiful kind of Queen Anne's and Italianates down this way. And this one was always kind of like odd man out, right? The vinyl siding, I think, hid a lot of details. It looked very vernacular. And I don't say vernacular as a bad thing. Vernacular architecture is very common. And that means that you might not have as many high stylistic elements in a house. In fact, most people live in vernacular homes. And in the 19th century, it meant that your home might just have been built by a home builder rather than you know, an architect. It might not have had an official design. I do like this one's kind of asymmetrical. If you really look at it, there's still a lot of things to kind of appreciate. I would describe this house as mildly Gothic, right? So this isn't, to use a modern analogy, you know, this isn't, you know, wearing full, you know, makeup and chains everywhere. This is somebody who just shops at Hot Topic, right? You know, they're just mildly Gothic, just a little bit, right? But we actually have some tax records that go all the way back to the 1870s on this house. And one of the first people paying taxes here was a guy named Cyrus Stockwell. Cyrus Stockwell was actually the surgeon up at Fort Gratiot. And we actually have some of his surgical kits on display in the local museum at that hospital. So that's pretty cool to see. But the other really interesting guy is named DeWitt Clinton, and he was the founder. He was a judge, and he was a investor in a number of different properties. In fact, by the 1880s, when we know he's living here, he was working at the Customs House. So that's the federal building today. And he was actually the founder of KPAC. So some really interesting residents who have called this home over the years. So, oh yeah, we can really see kind of back behind here. Lost some of the roof, obviously, lots of damage from that fire. So, like I said, if I had to wager a guess, we might not have this one too long. I don't know if they'll be able to rebuild or if it will make economic sense to. Obviously, tearing down a structure in a historic district, that it'll be a little bit of paperwork involved, but I would speculate that the district would kind of understand. When you have this amount of damage and things become like a safety issue, what are you gonna do? But we can really appreciate this little 19th century treasure here in the middle of the district while we can still take a look. We can see also did a little damage again to the house next door. Historic homes are typically quite close to each other, and so that's one of the real dangers from fire. So folks, I'll remind everyone, you make sure your smoke detectors are working, make sure you've got a fire extinguisher in the home. You know, especially you live in an old home. These things did, and will continue to burn down. We've got another, this is kind of an interesting one. This is almost like a Greek revival. The house next door here is a duplex. It's always been a duplex. We had a lot more duplexes built in the 19th century than we do today. Has some very simple kind of Doric columns. So the 4 columns in the front don't have a really highly stylized capital. Pretty simple. It's called Doric styling. And the neat thing on this one is the dentils. There's one of our architectural terms for the day. So we see the pediment. That's this triangle guy up here at the top. And the whole thing is called an entablature. And maybe we'll talk about that in depth sometime when we go to a really nice Greek revival house. This one has some Greek revival elements, let's say, but also some Italianate elements, things like the brackets up there that we saw just down the way, kind of mirrored up this way. But one thing that's very prominent here are these big, thick dentils. And that's these little blocks here. They look like teeth. Looks like a great big porch could eat you here, but very well maintained. And we see that is also next to another home that's got some brackets. Lots of these Italianates that were so popular in the middle of the 19th century. This one kind of asymmetrical, some beautiful work on the porch, and up above on that frieze board there, we see kind of little oval shapes. One of the other things that's kind of neat to see when you look at some of these older homes too, and you can usually tell when they're grandfathered in, the porches here, the balusters, all right? So that's the little fence basically that we see around the outside of the porch. They're very short. They would not meet modern safety codes, but frequently they would look all out of proportion if you had to completely modernize them. So that's the nice thing about a historic district, is sometimes you can get some exemptions and things like that. So, like I said, we're going to walk just a block or two down, might point out a thing or two, but talk just a little bit about a historic district. Port Huron has two of them. There's one downtown, and there's, of course, the Court Street. This is a residential historic district. And they are a way to preserve like local historic and cultural integrity. And you don't always see them. Some people tend to think that they're, very onerous. That's the biggest misconception, is that people think you can't even, paint your house or put up a, poster or anything without running it between the Historic District Commission. And it's not the case. Every district will be a little bit different with their ordinances because there's something established at the local level. But frequently, like here in Port Huron, basically the only time you have to worry about the Historic District Commission is if you were doing something that required a building permit anyway. So you're already going to have to do some paperwork for sure. So frequently older things like this house has some cement board siding. I would imagine there's clapboard underneath there. So while that's not original to the home, I'm sure that is, grandfathered in. Another beautiful Queen Anne up this way that I know was rather lovingly restored by, I believe, a former member of the Historic District Commission, among quite a few other things in town. You can always tell those Queen Annes with those kind of asymmetrical big front porches. So we're going to walk actually just kind of up to 10th Street here, because that's the borders. This isn't a huge historic district. Port Huron has a lot of historic homes that are not all in the district. So if there's a home that's not in the district, you aren't required to go before that Historic District Commission. And even if you want to do something on your home, if you're running it before the Historic District Commission, if it's something, pretty minor or isn't altering a lot of the historic characteristics, there's a good chance that they will give you a waiver or an exception anyway. It all depends on what you want to do. Now, if you have a beautiful home, you want to like staple vinyl siding up because it just makes your life a little bit easier, well, that might have been something you want to think about before you bought in the district, right? And ultimately that district improves the entire community, helps everybody's home values a little bit, and keeps some pretty amazing things around. One of the biggest other misconceptions about a historic district is a building can be on the National Register of Historic Places, which I know we've talked a little bit about. It can be on the state register. That doesn't really offer you any protections. Another beautiful, I love this one. This is kind of an Italianate villa plan. So it's got this central tower, kind of a rectangle around it, something you might see, very ornate styles of, might look like the Addams family or something lives there, but another popular style from the 1870s. This one, let's see, we can even look at the date. One of the cool things about our historic districts, we can really see 1884. So there's little markers there on some of the homes to tell you what year they are. Now, those will all be bounded, and this is all something by like local ordinance. So they have the same kind of effect as building code, but amazing to think your building could be on the historic district or your building could be on the National Register, and what's going to cause a bigger amount of protection is actually the local historic district. Here's another, this is a great colonial revival. So this one's from 1939. It looks like it could be from the 1700s. Right, very, very simple. We see these like 6/6 windows up in the top and like some bigger 8/8 in the bottom with these simple sashed windows. But this is very typical of a revival style. And I know I've got a whole episode planned where we're going to talk about revivals in the very near future. So a number of, again, beautiful homes, and we can see that work is going to be done on these things. Maintenance has to be done. Additions are sometimes added. Maintenance can all be, you can square that circle pretty easily. I know most historic districts, especially if it's a personal home, They'll be far more lenient now if you're a landlord and you own, a whole, a dozen homes or 50 homes or something like that, and you're maybe deferring some maintenance or making a choice that's not about preservation but about saving you some money. That's again when the few times you get a little bit of a maybe a headbutt with the district commission in what they'll tell you to do, or tell you like, hey, that's all part of living in the district, right? Another beautiful kind of Queen Anne style, but I like the Gothic element of the gargoyle up on this house. One of my favorites, historic Court Street. Another beautiful Queen Anne right down here as well. So white and kind of a light blue, some accents, maybe even some dark blue down on the porch. But we're coming right here to the very end of the district here at 10th Street. We'll get to this sign here, take a look, we'll walk back down the other side. So I want to also talk a little bit about that First Congregational Church. There's some really interesting stories there, but I know we need a little bit of a break, so we're going to throw it over again to thank our sponsors. All that historic work you can do with Adair Supply.
At Adair Supply, we believe in hard work, hometown pride, and materials that stand the test of time. Whether you're building new or bringing life back to something old, you'll find it here. Quality lumber, reclaimed treasures, and small-town service you can count on. Adair Supply, your hometown source for new and reclaimed building materials. Located on St. Clair Highway, and we're open all winter.
All right, thanks again to Adair Supply. So I'm back now on the other side of the street. We are heading back east on Court Street. Again, it's a small enough boundary. Some cities have enormous historic districts that you would be hard-pressed to walk in a couple of hours. And some do have rather onerous rules. I think of like San Francisco. When you think of San Francisco, most people tend to think of the Golden Gate Bridge. They think of steep hills. Maybe they're thinking of the car chase from Bullitt. I always think of like the intro to Full House and some of those painted ladies, those beautiful Queen Anne homes from right around the turn of the 20th century, the ones that survived the Great Shake in 1906. And when that is so integral to the identity of your entire city, yeah, I can see why they might be a little tight with some of those rules and regulations. Like I said, the historic district here, Port Huron, and other historic districts you might find around St. Clair County, they're full of people just like you and me who probably like history, they like old buildings, maybe they're even involved in the trade. They would be people who you want to have helping you when you work on your historic home, one of these districts. One of the other buildings here, we're again kind of walking down the street. This is another great little gem, this building here. I know I've included this in a number of my architectural tours, trolley tours, and even a church tour that we do, because this building is clearly like not a home, right? Uses some of the architectural vocabulary of actually like a bank or something, but it was actually built as a synagogue. So today it's a church. Today there's a cross up there in the pediment. This one is a very kind of classically inspired. This is very Greek Revival, kind of looks like a little Greek temple, right? So a lot of people using this kind of iconography. One of the things I really like, these are some great examples of Ionic columns. So they've got those little scroll work up at the top. And you wouldn't think this would be all that big a deal, right? To talk about columns and what kind of capitals they have. That's up at the top, Doric or Corinthian, but believe it or not, not to get into too much modern politics, but I did just see they were talking about changing the columns at the White House. And obviously that's going to be such an iconic building. And they're talking about that kind of little detail. And I was like, wow, that's something I have a very oddly specific amount of information about. And questions about updating things and whether you should or you shouldn't. We'll leave that be. You can go argue in the comments, but amazing to think that those kind of little details do get talked about the capital on your column is still a way to make CNN or the New York Times today. But amazing little synagogue. Port Huron did have a sizable Jewish population until well into the 20th century. There is still a synagogue over in Sarnia. And of course, there's a little Jewish cemetery as well, Mount Sinai over by Lakeside. Some more beautiful homes here. I love the gingerbread on this house. So that's that barrage board up at the top. And it's kind of that wavy, wiggly, waggly barrage board. One of the kind of neat things, I always love the intersection of technology and buildings. That stuff became popular shortly after the invention of the jigsaw. Probably not all that surprising. As soon as it became easy to do with a very specific niche tool, everybody wants some on their house. So there's some gingerbread up there as well. I also really like the balusters here. Another great example of original balusters. Very, very short little fence. That would look very funky if you had to have that, you know, like 36-inch, whatever the modern building code is for the really tall balusters. They're also a great way to throw out some color. There's some great color on this house. I like the Easter eggs hanging. We can tell that it's spring for sure. So one other thing about historic districts before we quite get back all the way to the church to talk about that is sometimes there's an opportunity for some grant money. A lot of that will come from the state. Every year there are giant tax credits. I know at least one in Michigan the last couple of years that you've been able to get a 25% tax credit. So any of the work that you do, if it's approved by an accredited historic district that is in a certified local government, which I know Port Huron's working on. It's just a little bit more paperwork, but you could get a 25% tax credit on that. I mean, how great is that? The opportunities for a personal grant and personal money for working on a historic building that isn't a 501c3 or anything are few and far between. So that's a huge advantage of having one of those historic districts. I love this building here on the corner. I love there's these two windows that stick out at the top up in that gable. I've never seen anything quite like them. Probably lets in a lot of light up there. Very unique structure here. Like the brick on the bottom and has kind of shingle sided up on the top. A very unique building for sure with a little archway down at the bottom. Now sometimes buildings within a historic district can get pretty significantly changed, and this is one that happened. This is actually from before my time in the Historic District Commission. This is the old First Congregational Church, and boy, you can tell this isn't like the original. The First Congregational Church goes all the way back to like 1838. It was downtown. It's one of the oldest churches in town. I know the Episcopalians and the Congregationists would go back and forth about who was older because one had a building first and the other had kind of a congregation first. To me, I kind of chuckled. I said the Catholics had everybody beat when the French were having mass here back in the 1680s. But back in the 1830s, a couple of the early churches. Now this one went through at least 3 churches, and this most recent one I think is a Hammond and Wythe, local architects who have done a lot of really cool mid-century buildings, and this is a mid-century masterpiece right here. Now, it's probably no surprise this was originally stained glass. I'm a little bummed that it's kind of just a little more corporate now, but stained glass is kind of one of those hallmarks of a church, right? And this is now the shipping and receiving door. Wild to think that's no longer the back of a very obvious mid-century I guess chapel, or what would we call that? The main part of your church, because the building is really kind of spread out and has a lot of these mid-century features, because not only do you have your regular kind of worship hall back here, you're also going to have classrooms, other things like that. And so this building was in the 60s, like 1968, 69, updated to the footprint we see here. And that's long before the Historic District Commission was created. So obviously all of this was basically grandfathered in, but this was no longer a church. I think a little less than, a decade ago, the 20-teens anyway, they kind of consolidated a couple of congregations, and so First Congregational didn't function like that anymore. And some of this is new, so they filled in some of this brick wall. There was a little courtyard back there, so there was an expansion and an addition to the church to turn it into mixed use. And that's something that in the historic preservation world we call adaptive reuse. And that's actually something we really like to see, right? If the alternative was just tearing this down and creating a cookie cutter little medical center, how boring would that be? I'd love it if all my shipping and receiving centers had beautiful stained glass, right? It would definitely be a different look. So this is a great way to preserve these buildings while using them for a different purpose. So really a great example here in that historic district. And they worked with the Historic District Commission to get permission for all of that. And we can see all the different things here in the Blue Water Medical Building. One of the other nice things about historic adaptive reuse like that, I'm always a fan of saying that the greenest building is the one that's already built, right? So we're in an era where sustainability is an increasingly common thing to look at. Of importance for a lot of people is how sustainable can you make your building? Well, by reusing, adaptive reuse, by reusing an older historic building for something else, you're going to make that kind of carbon credit go a lot further. So you always get a lot more out of that. So there we have it. I think we've seen most of the kind of interesting historic parts. We're here in the parking lot. There's a lot more to see in this historic district. I think we'll have to do maybe a part 2 sometime, walking down a couple of the other streets, looking at maybe some of the other historic churches like the First Presbyterian or St. John's. Beautiful, beautiful buildings here in downtown Port Huron, and we're lucky to have them here in the Blue Water area. So always excited to see and share some of those stories with all of you. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you have an idea for somewhere else that you think I should visit, throw those up in the comments as well. You know, the sky's the limit. We're Thumb Coast TV, so we go all over Michigan's Thumb Coast. I can't wait for, summer, really warm weather. We'll get way up there and see a lot of the historic treasures we have all over. So until next time, again, I'm Andrew Kercher, out here standing on a corner in our historic district, and so thankful that you could join me in walking around the block. Until next time.